Series. This series, one of our most ambitious programs, titled The Literature of Sustainability, Reading, Writing, and the SDGs, runs from today, February, till December 2025, and covers all 17 SDGs. It's not necessarily in sequence because it has depended upon the availability of speakers. But before speaking about that, a word or two about the chair, that if there are new people who have joined. The UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Studies came to the University of Hyderabad in 2022, and it's a 4-year chair. And it's a teaching and research unit, and we have hosted programs in the way of workshops, short-term programs, lecture series, of which citing vulnerability is one of our more popular ones. The talks all go up online as online educational resource OERs on the chair's website. We have had theorists, we have had economists, we have blog posts by various people on different aspects of vulnerability, from art and film to graphic novels. We have had graphic medicine and the medical humanities, and a wide variety of things. We have last year done a short-term program on SDGs, and this is a more sustained version of that. So, like I said, this is one of the chair's most ambitious projects, and we are delighted to be able to do something connected so intimately with the United Nations own agenda. So a quick read through of the list, SDG 1, which Professor Joseph Entin initiates today. Then we have SDG 2, and all these are literary cultural studies scholars, so please note that. SDG 2, Miriam Mara of Arizona State University. SDG 3, Lucy Burke, Manchester Metropolitan, UK. SDG 4, Jessie Cordes Selbin, Gettysburg College, USA. SDG 5, Bonnie Zaire, Virginia Tech. SDG 6 has a 3-member panel: Isabel Hofmeyr, Sharon Lavery, and Sarah Natal of the University of Witwatersrand, South Africa, and the head of environment policy, United Nations Environmental Program, Balakrishna Pisupati. SDG 7, Stacey Balcon, Florida Atlantic. SDG 8, Cindy Weinstein, Caltech. SDG 9, Claire Petit, University of Cambridge. SDG 10, Nick Liu, Marist College, USA. I think I saw Nick Liu logging in today, so yes. SDG 11, Christine Daigle, Brock, University of Canada. SDG 12, Caroline Elizabeth Miller, University of California, Davis. SDG 13, Jennifer Wenzel, Columbia. SDG 14, Cecilia Asberg, Linköping, University of Sweden. SDG 15, Sarah Bezan, who's here with us today from the University College Cork, Ireland. SDG 16, Alfred Lopez, Purdue. And SDG 17, Sean Cubitt, University of Melbourne, Australia. We hope to cover a lot of ground across the various SDGs. I am delighted that Professor Joseph Entin, up very early, as we have all been saying, from the United States, speaking on poverty and the ends of American literature. Thanks to so many of you who have joined. Thanks particularly also to Atul, who runs the entire logistics of these events. The talks will be put up as OERs over a period of time, not necessarily at the end of the series, given that it's a very long one. I'm also very grateful to our regulars who joined, Roy Matthew in particular, and of course to my faculty fellow, Anna Kurian. Over to Atul for a more formal introduction to our speaker for the day. Welcome again, Joseph, Sarah, and as I see, Nick too. Over to you, Atul.
Thank you, sir. Welcome everybody once again to the Literature of Sustainability, Reading, Writing, and the SDGs. Our speaker for today, our inaugural talk, the speaker is Professor Joseph Entin from Brooklyn College at the City University of New York. If I may formally introduce Professor Entin to you. Joseph Entin is Professor of English and American Studies at Brooklyn College, City University of New York. His most recent books are Living Labor, Fiction, Film, and Precarious Work, published in 2023, and Until We Are Seen, Public College Students Expose the Hidden Inequalities of the COVID-19 Pandemic, published in 2024, which has been co-edited with Jean Theo-Harris. In 2022, he co-edited with Claire Callahan, Irwin Hunt, and Kinohi Nishikawa a special issue of American Literature on how American literature understands poverty. Today, his talk is titled Poverty and the Ends of American Literature. Over to you, Professor Entin.
Okay, thank you, Atul, for that kind introduction. It's an honor to have been invited to inaugurate this lecture series on literature and the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and it was terrific to hear the full list. And I want to start by thanking Professor Nayar, the UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Studies, and Professor Anna Kurian, who graciously extended the invitation to me to speak, and to everyone else, Atul, and everybody else who had a hand in making this possible. So thank you. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here. I think the questions the series provokes are both fascinating and important. And this is a talk, I'll say, with a lot of questions in it, but hopefully also a few answers. How can literature illuminate the 17 Sustainable Development Goals? What insights into the dynamics of development can literature provide that we might otherwise not be attuned to? Given that matters of economic, social, and cultural development are overwhelmingly left to the social sciences, it makes sense to ask, what is the office of the humanities, especially literature and literary studies, in promoting and helping us understand sustainable development and the problems that it seeks to address? My purview today is Sustainable Development Goal number 1, end poverty in all its forms. And my thinking about this started with two primary questions. What can literature help us understand about poverty that other fields, such as the social sciences, often might not? And what can literature about poverty help us see about literature more generally? In what follows, I'll open with a brief kind of literary reading of SDG number 1, and then turn to some recent theories of poverty in the US social sciences and cultural studies. I'll then transition to a capsule history of the frequently contradictory and often problematic ways that poverty and the poor have been depicted in American literature, in particular focus on novels and documentary texts from the 1930s. I'll conclude by suggesting some possibilities for how literature can complicate and challenge what historian Alice O'Connor calls poverty knowledge, that is, prevailing social and political perspectives that have frequently blamed the poor themselves for the poverty they suffer. And I'll do that by examining two novels, one from 1939 and one from 2019. In the end, I'll try to suggest that even if it is not always delivered on this promise, literature has the potential to depict poverty and the poor otherwise, beyond mere lack, objection, and bare life, and thus to open new ways for thinking about poverty's causes, structural dynamics, and human impacts, as well as the alternative epistemologies and modes of sociality which the poor developed in the face of their dispossession. My mouth is having a hard time working here early in the morning, but I'll get going. Forgive me. I want to note at the outset that I'm sure this talk would read differently if delivered by an expert in literatures of the global South. But I trust there is a value to examining the way that poverty is understood and depicted in the literature of one of the world's most hyper-capitalist societies, the United States. Finally, I should say that the ideas presented here are drawn from my own research and writings, but also from my collaboration with Professors Claire Callahan, Irvin Hunt, and Kinohi Nishikawa, with whom I co-edited a special issue of the journal American Literature on the topic, How Literature Understands Poverty. Okay, we can advance the slide, Atul, if you don't mind. I want to start with a quick look at UNDG number 1, to eradicate extreme poverty for all people everywhere by 2030. Certainly, this is a laudable and ambitious objective. The UN website explains, and here I'm quoting, eradicating poverty in all its forms and dimensions is an indispensable requirement for sustainable development. So far, so good. But when we turn to the causes of poverty outlined on the site, some questions emerge for me. The UN website states, and here I quote, "Poverty has many dimensions, but its causes include unemployment, social exclusion, and high vulnerability of certain populations to disasters, diseases, and other phenomena which prevent them from being productive," unquote. I fear the wording here may obscure as much as it illuminates what in turn causes unemployment and social exclusion and vulnerability. I would venture they ultimately flow from structural systems such as multinational capitalism, imperialism, and racism, which the UNDG site seems reluctant to name as such. And what does it mean to say the poor are not, quote unquote, productive? Many, probably most of the world's poor work, although they may be laboring outside the formal wage economy. But I think it is dubious to claim that they are unproductive. Indeed, such an assessment seems to be made from the outside rather from the point of view of the poor themselves. Do the poor see their own lives as unproductive? Is it possible that the work the poor do, whether that's poorly paid wage labor, underpaid piecework, or labor in the so-called informal sector, or unpaid domestic work, is it possible that all that work, in fact, makes the world go round? What metrics do we use to measure the poor and their productivity? And where do we stand when we apply those measures? What is the experience of poverty? How does poverty shape the intimate elements of existence, the psychic, as well as the material dimension of life? And how do we address poverty in a way that can account for those lived and living complexities? Okay, next slide. Perhaps the most notable recent study of these matters in the United States is Poverty by America, published in 2023 by Princeton University sociologist Matthew Desmond, whose previous book, Evicted, won the Pulitzer Prize. Poverty by America argues that poverty is a multifaceted problem with an array of structural causes, from the decline of unions, which now represent less than 10% of US workers, to state welfare policies that benefit the middle and upper classes more than the poor, to patterns of what Keeanga-Yamada Taylor calls predatory inclusion, which bring the poor into the economic system but force them to pay more proportionately for housing, banking, transportation, and food. Desmond stresses that poverty in the US is indeed pervasive. America, he writes, is at once the richest country on earth, yet with more poverty than any other advanced democracy. There are more than 38 million people living in the US who cannot afford basic necessities. More than 1 million US school children are homeless. 18 million Americans live in deep poverty, subsisting on less than half the official poverty line. But Desmond also insists that poverty cannot be fully measured by statistics. Poverty inflicts physical pain and vulnerability, injury and illness, emotional trauma, as well as economic and social instability. Poverty is, he underscores, the loss of liberty, the feeling the government is against you. It is shame-inducing, often humiliating. It is, in his words, quote, diminished life and personhood. His primary claim is that poverty exists because of what he calls exploitation, and he's not using that in a Marxist sense. He argues that poverty is actively produced for the benefit of some at the expense of the poor, a we in whose voice he writes the book. Desmond contends that poverty persists because it is lucrative for everyone who doesn't experience it themselves. Tens of millions of Americans do not end up poor by a mistake. Of history or personal conduct, he explains. Poverty persists because some wish and will it to. And I applaud Desmond's insistence that poverty is not accidental, but rather integral, in his effort to reorient policy away from a focus on the poor and their behavior to the larger structures of poverty that benefit the non-poor. Poverty, he notes, is our design, our social contract. Yet to my eyes, his claim that those who benefit from poverty are essentially everyone else seems to lack precision. The people who benefit the most from poverty are, of course, those who benefit the most dramatically from inequality, economic elites and multinational corporations. After all, the collective worth of America's 813 billionaires is more than twice as much wealth as the entire bottom 50% of the American population. So while millions of well-to-do Americans benefit from the perpetuation of poverty, the benefits accrue exponentially to those at the top of the economic scale, a fact that Desmond doesn't emphasize, perhaps because, understandably, he hopes to engender a sense of responsibility in middle-class readers in the hopes they will act to undo their privileges. In fact, in a passage near the end of the book, Desmond reassures his readers that eliminating poverty in the US need not entail erasing income inequality. He says, we could make meaningful gains in equality, certainly enough to abolish poverty, and still have miles and miles of separation between the top and the bottom. We can end poverty, Desmond seems to be suggesting, without unsettling the fundamental inequalities of our economic system. But I don't want to be misunderstood. Desmond's book is a crucial corrective to so many accounts that have historically addressed poverty not by anatomizing the structures of exploitation that create and maintain poverty, but by scrutinizing, sensationalizing, chastising, or demeaning the poor themselves. Okay, next slide. Thank you. Desmond's book is an effort to challenge what historian Alice O'Connor calls poverty knowledge, prevailing social science and political discourses about the poor. O'Connor contends that for most of the 20th century, poverty knowledge privileged the expertise of professional researchers and largely excluded poor people themselves as sources of insight and knowledge, and tended to blame the poor themselves for their poverty. This dynamic has ironically placed poverty knowledge in a position not just to reflect, but to replicate the very social inequalities it means to investigate. O'Connor argues that poverty knowledge is an exercise in power, in this instance of an educated elite, to categorize, stigmatize, but above all to neutralize the poor and disadvantaged through analysis that obscures the political nature of social and economic inequality. Through what passes for mainstream knowledge, the poor become fixed in a state of lack and need, static and degraded figures, as if members of another race who lack the agency that by contrast is presumed to define the middle class people who study or read about the poor. These ideas long dominated US discourse. In, for instance, Columbia University anthropologist Oscar Lewis's Culture of Poverty thesis, which argued that the values and behaviors of the poor, rather than the larger structural factors, trap them in poverty. The poor themselves, their habits and lifestyles are to blame. And that, again, has been the prevailing logic for most, both social science and literary discourse in the United States for much of the 19th and 20th centuries. There has, of course, been a great deal of revisionist work in the social sciences in recent years. I think particularly the work of Carol Stack, Michel Dunier, and many others. But I want to suggest that the disequilibrium that marked much social science writing in the 19th and 20th centuries has also shaped American literature. But first, I want to start by asking why literary representations, in fact, matter. And I'm going to start with critic Richard Dyer, who has argued that representations are not mere epiphenomena, but have real consequences for real people, because representations delimit and enable what people can be in any given society. Along similar lines, noted French theorist Jacques Rancière has contended that reality does not merely exist to be delineated in writing, but in fact, these are his words, the real must be fictionalized in order to be thought. Literature, Rancière states, produces effects in reality, drafts maps of the visible, trajectories between the visible and the sayable, relationships between modes of being, modes of saying, and modes of doing and making, constructing what he calls the fabric of the sensible. Perhaps literature lays bare the very grounds on which we can see, comprehend, discern, and thus act on social phenomena like poverty. From this perspective, literature does not merely reflect, but actively shapes the world, at once establishing the very common sense that governs the way we see, and also helping us to see with a degree of self-consciousness the arbitrariness or contingency of the terms on which that common sense is established, and also perhaps occasionally offering us ways of seeing and feeling that gesture beyond the prevailing ideas and dispositions that compose the fabric of dominant and official modes of perception. Anyway, that's my ambitious hypothesis, and I'll come back to that later on. Okay, next slide. Poverty, along with class and labor, continues to be substantially understudied topics in American literary studies, and it's quite a glaring absence. But there have been some vital contributions in the last 20 years. Gavin Jones's book, American Hungers, The Problem of Poverty in U.S. Literature, published in 2007, suggested that writers have produced a sophisticated literary stream that, quote, reveals how poverty is established, defined, understood in discourse as a psychological and cultural problem that depends fundamentally on the language used to describe it, unquote. For Jones, then, literature exposes the way that poverty is always produced within and by discourse. Yet he contends that the focus in contemporary literary studies on oppressed subject positions, again, these are his words, on oppressed subject positions has tended to evade the problems of economic inequality by centering the social marginalization on the cultural identity of the marginalized. So he's arguing the kind of focus on identity in American literary studies has obscured the structural dynamics, and that's a problem. And other scholars, Keith Gandal and Walter Ben Michaels, have agreed with him that the problem of identity has really obscured other structural factors. Yet in the most, next slide, yet in the most recent major book on poverty in US and British literature, Or Things, How Those with Money Write About Those Without It, published just last year by Leonard Davis, Davis argues that identity is precisely the issue, contending that only those writers who are or were raised poor are qualified to write about the poor. Davis surveys an array of British and American writings from the 19th and 20th centuries and identifies what he calls representational inequality, in which depictions of the poor tend overwhelmingly to be written by the non-poor, and show us numbingly, these are his words, show us a numbingly repetitive series of situations, descriptions, and tropes, all focused on the revolting living conditions of the poor: violence, addiction, sexual license, crime, and lack. Davis calls this tradition or genre pornography, a mix of prurient interest and disdain for the poor that overwhelmingly affirms middle-class privilege and the economic and status quo. In contrast, Davis argues, rather than sensationalizing the poor or casting them as horribly degraded or debased, depictions of poverty by writers who are or were raised poor ask us to dwell with the everyday details, to tarry with the complexities of the mundane existence of impoverished people. Most literary writing about poverty done by the non-poor, however, has an ethnographic structure. It is designed to introduce one group of people, the poor, to another, middle and upper class readers, and often serves, ironically, to consolidate the distance and difference between an alien other and a familiar us. Davis observes, the desire to reform that almost always marks writing about the poor by the non-poor is often intricately linked to the desire to demarcate, separate, and condemn, and to frame poverty ultimately as a product of the poor's own cultural pathology and moral failure. And Davis's book, again, is overwhelmingly about the problems of writing about poverty in British and American literature and the way that it's reproduced a set of stereotypes that are quite damaging about the poor. Next slide. I was going to say, I find problematic the sort of binaristic ontological logic of Davis's claim, which suggests that only those who are poor or raised poor can write effectively about poverty. And with his skepticism that structural analysis almost by nature obscures the humanity of the poor. But his argument, I think, is provocative and important, certainly a challenge to so much US literature about the poor and working classes. And indeed, there's a long genealogy of literary texts in the US blaming the poor, stretching back at least to the mid-19th century. Accounts of urban sunshine and shadows to such well-known texts as Charles Loring Brace's The Dangerous Classes of New York from 1872, the very title of which implies the threatening alterity the poor embody in the eyes of the well-to-do. And perhaps most famously, Jacob Riis's How the Other Half Lives, which depicts a city riven between genteel society on the one hand and the dark tenements on the other half, which Riis contends, and these are his words, throw off a scum of 40,000 human wrecks to the island asylums and workhouses year by year, unquote. To be sure, Riis's landmark book underscored the material and environmental causes of poverty, the lack of air and light, the overcrowded and unsafe conditions in the tenements. But the book also implies that tenement residents absorb the debased quality of their surroundings, becoming degraded themselves. Many tenants, Riis asserts, quote, had sunk to the level of their surroundings. Riis's voyeuristic tour through the tenement's dark bedrooms, that's his phrase, frequently followed the police, who at times burst into apartments and room houses at night to expose the dangers lurking within. Once he acknowledges, in taking a flashlight picture of a group of blind beggars, I managed to set fire to the house. Riis's report in the book is both a plea to aid the immigrant poor who inhabit the city's shadowy other half, and also a warning about the looming threat those same restless, pent-up multitudes pose to the propertied classes, which I think we can sense in this carefully composed image, Bandit's Roost here on the right. How the Other Half Live aims to expose and enclose, to illuminate and contain. The world of the poor is at once dangerous and perversely alluring in Riis's eyes. If the turn of the century period, marked by progressive era reform and literary naturalism's interest in the lives of social outcasts, represented a spike in writing about poverty that sort of culminated in Riis's book, the 1930s, when the crisis of the Great Depression brought economic devastation to so many people in the United States, is another such moment. Okay, next slide. And perhaps no Depression-era literary text about poverty is more celebrated than Let Us Now Praise Famous Men from 1941, James Agee's lyrical documentary about Alabama tenant farmers featuring photographs by Walker Evans, which opens by questioning the very power dynamic structuring the venture in the first place. Agee finds it not only curious, but indeed obscene that at the behest of an organ of journalism, in this case Fortune magazine, he and Evans would pry intimately into an undefended and appallingly damaged group of human beings, an ignorant and helpless rural family, for the purposes of parading the nakedness, disadvantage, and humiliation of these lives before another group of human beings. Offering an acerbic challenge to liberal middle-class sympathy, Agee continues, quote, "This is a book about sharecroppers, and it is written for all those who have a soft place in their hearts for the laughter and tears inherent in poverty viewed at a distance, and especially for those who can afford the retail price." Here, Agee deftly exposes the class privilege that allows his readers to consume the tenant's misery from an armchair and feel good about it. Elsewhere in the book, he traces powerful environmental forces, the debt and arduous labor inherent in the sharecropping system, the discriminatory force of institutionalized education that keep the tenants locked in destitution. Yet, Agee's description of the tenants as damaged and ignorant veers toward an essentialist, even biological reading of their desperate condition. In the course of trying to defend the tenants, these farmers, to explain their human singularity and indeed, as Agee sees it, their divinity, he also renders the poor as genetically flawed figures, stuck in a generationally repeating poverty from which there seems to be no exit. And, I think we can see that actually in this image by Evans, the photo in the book that I find the most unsettling, which seems to compound the vulnerability of the poor to prying middle-class eyes as they are exposed literally naked before us. These books by Rees and Agee represent one major canon of poverty literature, which assumes not only an economic and social gap separating the poor from the non-poor, but a corresponding epistemological, even ontological divide. As framed by these texts, the poor reside elsewhere, in another world, in another time, stuck in a stunted, cyclical, seemingly eternal loop that spins without progressing. Occupying alternate temporal and spatial coordinates, the poor adhere to fundamentally different and often to middle-class observers disorienting and dysfunctional logics of behavior. As a result, in these works, poverty seems largely intractable and the poor caught in a perpetual present without a viable future. But in fact, poverty is relational and contextual. What it means to be poor depends on what it means to be well off, and that has changed over time and across contexts. Poverty has always existed, I imagine, as long as there have been social and economic stratification. But its meaning and significance are shaped by the conditions of the society in which it appears and is recognized. Can literature help us grasp poverty not as an immutable, static condition, but as something that is indeed relational, that does not passively occur, but is actively produced? And can literature help us grasp poverty not only from the point of view of the non-poor, of well-to-do commentators scrutinizing, sentimentalizing, or sensationalizing the poor from the outside, but from the perspective of the poor themselves, to understand the living complexity, productive capacity, and historical embeddedness of their lives? In other words, what other non-reductive, non-stultifying ways of understanding poverty, beyond pity and blame, does American literature have to offer? Okay, next slide. To think in alternative, more flexible ways about poverty and representation, one place to start is with Saidiya Hartman's remarkable book, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, which argues that the poor, especially the Black poor, are not invisible, static, pathetic, hapless, incompetent, or abject, as so many accounts would suggest. Rather, she argues they persist, build, create, and evade complete capture by the eye and pen of reform and the police. But to see the world from the perspective of the poor, and particularly the perspectives of young Black women at the turn of the 20th century in this book, requires creative and critical fabulation, a step beyond the official archives and documents, which are in the end not only inadequate, but serve to reinforce the oppressive social forces that bear down on the poor. Hartman contends that we need to grapple with what she calls the terrible beauty of the slum by crafting what she calls a counter-narrative liberated from the judgment and classification that subjected young Black women to surveillance, arrest, punishment, and confinement, and offer an account that attends to the beautiful experiments to make living an art undertaken by those so often described as promiscuous, reckless, wild, and wayward. The endeavor, she continues, is to recover the insurgent ground of these lives, to exhume the open rebellion from the case file, to untether waywardness, refusal, mutual aid, and free love from their identification as deviance, criminality, and pathology. The goal is to understand and experience the world as these young women did, to learn from what they know. Can literature help us understand and experience the world from the point of view of the poor, to show us the beautiful experiments the poor conduct, where most official sources and authorities see only deviance and degradation? To see the way poor people create possibility in spaces of enclosure, enact a radical art of subsistence in the face of deprivation, transfigure the given rather than merely succumbing to it. To see the poor not merely as objects pinned down by the structures of economic injustice, but as full, complex subjects capable, in Hartman's words, of redistributing the balance of need and want and finding a line of escape from debt and duty in the attempt to create a path elsewhere. How can literature illuminate the struggles of the poor against economic need to create a path elsewhere, as Hartman puts it? I want to pursue these questions by briefly examining two novels, one from the 1930s, Mary Dell Lesueur's The Girl, and one from 2019, Ocean Vuong's On Earth, We're Briefly Gorgeous. Okay, next slide. Thanks. I've missed my, I recreated my slide list and I missed one of my slides. So anyway, Meridel Lesueur's The Girl, which is an experimental social feminist novel that might be described as a form of vernacular modernism, offers a first-person chronicle of an unnamed barmaid in Depression-era St. Paul, Minnesota, a member of the rural poor who moves to the city in search of opportunities. The novel was written as a series of short pieces, many of which were published independently in the 1930s and 40s, but was not released as a whole until 1978. Lesueur was raised in an economically modest but not poor family of Midwestern socialists. She dropped out of high school, but during the 1930s worked for the Federal Writers Project and with the unemployed councils, which proliferated during the decade. The novel does not soft pedal the hardships and harm of being poor, especially being a poor woman. The girl is fortunate to have a job, but she faces harassment from male patrons in the bar and also from her mostly unemployed boyfriend, Butch, who physically and emotionally abuses her. Her best friend, Clara, subsists meagerly as a sex worker. The men in the novel, who are often compared to wolves and foxes and who have been devastated by the economic downturn of the Depression, try to rob a bank and are all killed. But the novel proceeds from there, beyond that ostensible ending. The bar where the girl and her friends work is shut down, and the girl herself, pregnant with Butch's baby, he had pushed her to get an abortion, but she had refused, is placed in a state-run home for single mothers, where she meets another young woman who organizes with the Workers' Alliance. The girl is eventually released from the home and joins a community of women living in an abandoned warehouse, siphoning electricity off the grid and scraping together work and food to keep themselves alive. The girl realizes that community and collective action are antidotes to the harsh individualism that dominate the society in which she lives, even if there is little hope for a truly revolutionary transformation. In this novel about the dialectics of deprivation and desire, hunger constitutes a key word, expressing complex, multivalent aspects of the girl's life. On one level, hunger is quite literal. It is the biting lack of nourishment that plagues the poor and unemployed characters in the book. At a wintertime demonstration at a large park, the girl remarks, "There are maybe 2,000 people," I said, "living right out there, hungry." Yet hunger is also a metaphor for the girl's ambitions and longings, for her refusal to accept the world and its restrictions, for her potential, her capacity. After the death of her father, who had abused the girl and her mother, she finds new access to her aspirations, telling Butch, quote, "I want everything. I got hungers. I want the earth. I feel rich. I feel heavy. I want meat, bread, children. I am starving. I am sitting here starving." Hunger is combated through food, often shared, but also through collectivity itself. As the girl notes near the end of the novel, quote, "I sit here close to other women and men and I look. I feed off their faces. They feed me. I don't feel scared when I am sitting there and it is warm and I am close to the bodies of others. I don't know them, but I know them all." The book underscores the way the poor are treated as less than human by the state and those with money. Butch asks, "My God, do we even belong to the human race or don't we?" "Some people don't think so," I said. But the novel also insists that poverty is not simply a state of abjection and lack. The poor are not simply victims, but active, thinking, productive subjects in the world, creative and resistant, able to evade or circumvent to some extent the policing function of the state and build a community of mutual aid that can sustain itself, not completely and wholly, but often effectively in the face of intense persecution, abuse, and deprivation. In the final scenes, masses of women march through the city demanding milk and iron for their pregnant sisters, and the girl gives birth to a baby girl, suggesting a new generation of feminists is emerging. Again, I apologize for my missing slide on that novel, but I recommend it to you if you don't know it. It's a novel that many people don't know, but I think it's fantastic. All right, finally, I want to look at a more contemporary text, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, a semi-autobiographical novel by Vietnamese-American writer Ocean Vuong, who also happens to be, I'll say, an alum of Brooklyn College where I teach, that takes the form of an extended letter from the narrator named Little Dog to his mother, an epistle that, because his mother never learned to read after her school was destroyed by American bombing during the war in Vietnam, she will never absorb. So it's sort of an impossible letter he's writing. The novel chronicles Little Dog's youth with his mother and grandmother in Hartford, Connecticut, and his love affair with an opioid-addicted white boy, Trevor. Wong's novel is a multifaceted text about immigration, about abuse and the afterlives of imperial war, about motherhood, intergenerational trauma and memory. It's a tale of queer love and desire and a portrait of the young gay man as an artist. It is also significantly about several dimensions of poverty, about working, aching, toxic, and underpaid in a nail salon where there are no salaries, no health care, no contracts. A job where the most common English word spoken by workers is sorry, which performs the lowering of oneself so the client feels right, superior, charitable. It is also about the hardship of trying to scrape together a living in a down and out post-industrial city in the northeastern United States where gunshots occasionally ring out in the night. About shopping for clothes at Goodwill and buying groceries at the local corner store on Franklin Avenue where the doorway was littered with used food stamp receipts, where staples like eggs and milk cost 3 times more than they did in the suburbs. It is about a long bus trip to the nearest mall to purchase 5 or 6 squares of chocolate as a rare treat on a month when there was a sliver of money left over after the bills were paid. It is about having 7 friends die young, 4 of them from drug overdoses. But if the novel deftly and carefully details the material ecology of urban immigrant poverty and its hardships and struggles, it also underscores the intricate, complicated beauty of the lives that Little Dog recounts. Quote, "I want to insist that our being alive is beautiful enough to be worthy of replication," the narrator states. Wong's novel emphasizes the pervasiveness of exploitation, privation, and harm, but also kindness, care, and reciprocity. The narrator massaging his mother's back after her excruciating day at the nail salon. The use of the greeting, "What's good?" in Hartford's working class precincts, which, in asking about life beyond hardship, serves as what Little Dog calls, quote, "a precious spark we sought and harvested for one another." And Trevor's erotic kindness to him at one particular moment of vulnerability, which the narrator experiences as, quote, "a kind of mercy." To be poor in Hartford is not to be invisible or wrecked or incapacitated, but to live and struggle and endure, to experience both hardship and beauty, to suffer material deprivation, but also find ways to persist and create. Quote, "They will say we never happened," the narrator notes near the end, "that our survival was a myth. But they're wrong. You and I, we were real. We laughed knowing joy would tear the stitches from our lips." Despite the pain, abuse, and death that Little Dog and his mother and grandmother face, there is something else. Quote, "It was beauty I learned that we had risked ourselves for." Wong's book offers not romance or nostalgia for a life of poverty, to be sure, but an insistence on the material dimensions of socioeconomic need, as well as the complex, indeed often beautiful lives that the poor, like everyone else, lead. Okay, let me offer some concluding thoughts, starting with 2 essential questions. What can we ask of literature in its depictions of poverty? What can literature do? What are its strengths, its limitations? Literature does not offer statistical or quantitative data, which are crucial to understanding and combating poverty. Rather, literature is the realm of the subjective. It can show us the convergence of the material and personal in the way that poverty takes shape in everyday lives. As Gavin Jones notes, quote, "The benefit of a literary approach to poverty is a capacity to illuminate the elusive and frequently controversial non-material effects of material situations. The cultural and psychological experiences of want amid wealth, the subjective patterns that necessarily fall beneath the radar of sociological efforts to isolate structural causes and to quantify levels of need." Literature is also about point of view. Not only is literature composed of language, through language, in language, but it often makes us aware of the language it is using, the way that language and representation shape our perspective, what we can see, feel, comprehend. Literature is a form of cognitive mapping that at its best brings our attention to the way our modes of seeing govern what is indeed legible. Literature, I think, can do what Gail Solomon argues theory can do, not only make apparent the structural and systemic formations, but also to help us think lives and their conditions of possibility otherwise, and to see in poverty something other than sedimented intractability. Literature, in other words, can help us see poverty from the point of view of the poor themselves, at times even when written by authors like Lesueur, who were not raised poor, and thus see the particular complexity of life as the poor experience it as more than mere lack or absence or objection, to see poverty as both systemic and deeply personal, to see the lives of the poor as governed by structural constraints and pain and exploitation, but also shot through with beauty and relation and creative resilience. Literary art is thus especially well suited to open up what Gavin Jones calls the complexities and contradictions of poverty. Okay, last slide. Here is how we articulated this argument in our introduction to the special issue of American Literature on Poverty. Extending poverty studies to include literary studies or vice versa offers the opportunity to reflect on how the literary, as a unique mode of representation, can elucidate the ways in which scarcity is manufactured in order to disinherit targeted populations, while also valuing the alternative epistemologies, forms of sociality, and aesthetic and cultural practices that communities produce in response to disinheritance. We need to recognize that the literature of poverty does not merely represent poverty, but in fact offers a theory of reading poverty that might help us recognize the forms of social and even material power the poor possess despite their active dispossession. Both The Girl and On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous are deliberate experiments in the novel as a genre, experiments in what we might call novelistic embodiment. They both attempt to do the impossible, to bring the body into language, onto the page, across the expanse from writer to reader. In Lesueur's novel, after the bank robbery and the death of Butch and the other male characters, the girl returns to the women she had worked and lived with, thinking to herself, "Now I know the whole city and the way those in it can be together. This you can't know or be at home with until you have lived it. No one can tell you. Now I am at home with my own body and the bodies of others, and I will do whatever there is to do." Near the end of On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, Little Dog asserts, "I never wanted to build a body of work, but to preserve these, our bodies, breathing and unaccounted for inside the work." Language and literature cannot fully or finally embody, but in trying, and by underscoring both the powers of literary representation and also its limitations, literature can gesture to the interconnection between the physical and the metaphysical, the social and the thematic, the structural and the personal, the socioeconomic and the linguistic. Literature can thus illuminate the challenges and necessity of rendering both the material and affective dimensions of poverty. What literature can do in the face of its own limitations is draw our attention to them, make us aware that language and representation almost always fail, an awareness we need to bring to all depictions of poverty we encounter, which so often ask us to place faith in their presumptive objectivity, transparency, and certainty. To see poverty and understand it, and to address and aspire to eradicate it, we need to represent it, to make it discursive. But in rendering it abstract and translatable, we must not lose sight of the necessary and necessarily stubborn particularities and specificities, facets of poverty that literature itself is so adept at helping us see. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Professor Entin. That was fascinating. Now, would you be taking questions and comments from the audience?
Sure.
We have Roy Matthew with a question. Roy, please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Entin. It was an amazing presentation. It reminded me of a certain novel. It's the novel All This Could Be Different by Sarah Thankam Matthews. It's about a rural Indian lesbian protagonist moving to the American city of Milwaukee to find better prospects. So, she is not unemployed. She has a job, but the conditions that she is surrounded by ensure that she is in a constant state of having just enough money to stay afloat, never more, and in many cases often very less also. So, and this is despite her Indian family thinking that she is now leading a wealthy life. So they also make demands of her, monetary demands, which she additionally has to fulfill. But as you mentioned, it's not a misery memoir. You know even though she's going through all this, she simultaneously, in the course of the novel, she finds things that she wants to. One is, of course, the love of her life. Another is a meaningful female friendship, which she was also on the lookout for. And she is able to connect more with her parents, and she has the courage to come out to her parents because she is finally at a large distance from them. And they also slowly start to accept her, and she's able to tell her parents about an instance of abuse that she suffered in her childhood. So it's not entirely a misery memoir. And another thing that I also wanted to mention is, like Satterthwaite and Milton's 9 aspects of urban poverty, 6 of them are things that are beyond the control of the individual. They are to do with inadequate provision of public infrastructure, basic services, no safety net, no protection for poor groups' rights, voicelessness, high prices for necessities. These are not things that the individual herself or themselves cannot ameliorate. So that works for this novel also, because she has very little choice, even though she stays afloat and finds many meaningful things to do. So that's what I wanted to observe.
Wow, that sounds like a fantastic and really provocative novel. And I don't know it. Would you mind dropping the name of it in the chat?
Absolutely.
I would love to see that. And again, yeah, I mean, I guess at some level, I'm making this claim that I think literature can help us, at its best, can help us grasp and understand the power both of material structure that are beyond the individual's, scope of control, but then also the ways in which, individuals, communities are able to, persist and create in the face of that. And I guess one of the questions I'd be curious to hear about that novel is, whether there is some experimentation at the level of language. One of the things that I like about both The Girl and Ocean Vuong, I mean, they're 2 novels that I don't think it's hard to imagine the context in which they would appear in the same place most often. One is, a novel written by a white woman from the 1930s, and the other one is a kind of novel written by an immigrant in contemporary United States. But they're both definitely experiments in language. And part of that experiment, I think, is an attempt to show us both what language can do and what it can't in some ways, to invent some other way of speaking, which I think is trying to remind us that the languages we've inherited to write and think and talk about poverty are inadequate. So I think there's something interesting too. And again, I'd be curious to know about that novel. If there's some experimentation at the level of literary style and form, because I think, again, that's something else that we talk about literature as opposed to, the social sciences or the other forms or genres or media, is we need to think about language and about literary style and form and the work that may be doing to help us think about whatever the topic is, in this case, poverty. So anyway, thank you so much for your comment.
Thank you, Professor.
Professor Entin, if I may.
Sure.
This is more in the nature of a comment than a question, but I was thinking about how, if you were to talk of poverty, for us in India, most literature that deals with the question of poverty is that which is also to do with our caste system. So Dalit literature and Dalit biographies, autobiographies, those are the ones which showcase poverty front and center. For American literature, it would be either the African American experience. So you see so much poverty across the African American canon. and that would be similar to what we have. So I was just looking at the Nikki Rosa poem by Nikki Giovanni, and which is about poverty, but about the joys that are still there, never mind how poor we are, that kind of thing. I was thinking about how you had a slide in which you said how the rich, not how the rich talk about the poor. There was, a book, I think Leonard Davis, wasn't it?
Yeah, Leonard Davis. It's basically how the non-poor write about the poor.
You're right. So would that then be central to how you're thinking about poverty as well? That if we are to see poverty differently, we have to look at it then maybe from the eyes of those who are there in that and still writing about it.
Right. Yes, absolutely. It's funny. The novel in the I think in the context that you're talking about in India that I know is Anand's Untouchable, which is such an incredible, such an incredible novel. The poem Nikki Rosa Wright is, for people that don't know, is, a kind of short poem that says people think about, because I grew up black and poor, that my life was just devastating and nothing. But in fact, I didn't really think about it that way at all. And it was full of love, kind of thing. Right. Is that a rough paraphrase? I do think that, and Leonard Davis makes this argument that really it's only people who are poor or were raised poor who can write about the poor. And I think, again, he makes a powerful case for that. And there is so much writing in the American literary tradition that is about poverty by people who aren't poor, and it often just fails miserably, right? It reproduces a set of stereotypes and what have you. And I think what literature can do through narrative form, style, experimentation, point of view is bring us to other places and help us see from the point of view, right, of poor people themselves. And my case is that, Meridel Lesueur is not somebody who was really raised poor, but she did a lot of reporting in the 1930s, particularly in welfare offices and talking to women. And she wrote journalistically for several left magazines. And she really got to understand the way that the poor women around her were writing. And so sometimes there are situations when, even people who weren't necessarily raised poor can write, I think, with real power and effectiveness, about that. But thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Rosa Lucy Rogers has a comment on the chat box. This is a quotation.
Oh, okay. Let me see if I can.
Is there anything you would want to elaborate on it? Or?
Let's see. I think language is fixed like a pane of glass, but through years it starts to drip and melt and change. The future is in our mouths. We articulate the world we'd like to live in. Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a wonderful quote. And, Vuong is such an amazing person and speaker. I wasn't aware. He graduated, I think, from Brooklyn College in 2012. And he never had a class with me, but I know several people who had him in class. And, he's a really brilliant fellow. And yeah, you can see here, right, that on the one hand, his novel, has some dimensions of realism. It is about the hard facts of everyday life lived by ordinary people, poor people, immigrants. But it's also a deeply poetic and lyrical novel. And there's a section near the end where the kind of traditional form of the novel kind of falls away and it becomes a series of kind of poetic aphorisms in which language does seem to kind of melt and change. And I think that fluidity of language that he's able to render on the page, again, is a challenge to the idea that the lives of the poor are static, right? Are stable, are just one thing. And again, I think there's a connection between the language of both of those two novels I was talking about and the way they're trying to challenge and upend our preconceptions about what poverty is. So thank you for that.
Susan Harris has a question. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about the set of responses to Katsu's novella, The Lives of Animals, and it's people from different disciplines responding to a literary text, and then Cora Diamond offers her take on it, and she criticizes this literature professor who offers a reading of that text, and to me it seems like she's saying that literature can't just offer it can't just be an example for a sociological issue, so it can't just offer a more nuanced sociological explanation for something, but at the same time it differs from philosophy because it's not offering therefore or because type of arguments. So then if we concede these 2 points or take them seriously, then with a social issue like poverty, what can literature do that does not make it just an example or just a deeper sociological examination of something?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, I wouldn't necessarily want to concede both of those points, because I think novels often do trace or expose or illuminate the connections, right, between individual lives and structural factors, right? And can do, there is some traffic between the social sciences and literature. And literature can do some of that work. But I'll say, in addition to perhaps helping us to really grasp the complexities of poverty, and I agree that that's not enough or sufficient, but I think there's something about the way in which literature can also make us self-conscious about representation itself and about language, right? And then we can turn around and think about depictions of poverty in other fields with a greater attunement to the language that's being used, right? And the conventions that those fields employ. And I think that that's something that, literature can do that is really important and we can bring to other fields and other subjects. At the start of the talk, I offered what is sort of a kind of literary studies reading of some of the language from the Sustainable Development Goal itself. And I think if we think about literature and literary studies as helping us cast a kind of critical eye on language and text, when we apply that to social science language, for instance, we can see things that we might not otherwise see. So anyway, that's at least one more case that I would make for the power of literature to help us understand and ultimately address poverty.
Thanks a lot, Professor Entin. Are there any more questions, comments, responses? If there are no more questions, we could move on to a formal vote of thanks by Professor Anna Kurian, the Faculty Fellow here at the UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Studies at the University of Hyderabad.
Thank you, Arthur. My usual job to say thank you to everybody. And let me begin with thanking Professor Entin, who had to do this early before his mouth kicked in, as he said, but you did a great job. And I'm sure all of us have learned considerably from all that you told us today. And especially, we would like to thank you for the references you gave, because it will help people to frame further projects from India as well, I'm sure. I also would like to thank all those who joined in, especially those who are going to be speakers in this series. We have at least 4 of them here today. And thank you to all the young people, all the students and teachers who come to listen to these talks at the end of a week. And I'm sure you're all looking forward to the weekend, but you're still here, you pay attention. Roy, of course, like one of our stalwarts, completely, always here. And we're very grateful to all of you for coming. Of course, thank you to Atul and to Pramod putting this together, doing the crowd work, and making it possible for us to have these talks, this series. Thank you once again. Professor Entin, I put in a poem for you as well in the chat box.
Oh, thank you. Okay, great. Wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much, everybody. It was really a delight to be here, and I'm grateful for all of you. It was the beginning of my day, but the end of your week. And I'm so grateful to you for coming out such at 6 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. So have a great weekend, and thanks again for having me.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Take care.